Right. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to our third session of 4. We got one more next week, and then we're finished this little series. So thanks for joining me over the last 2 weeks, and now we're into our third. As you guys would be aware, this study is from the Presbyterian Church in Canada, the National Indigenous Ministry Council, and Justice Ministries worked on this. They were going to be presenting it to the 2020 General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, but unfortunately that got canceled. And so instead, what they decided to do was to create a little study guide as a way of putting out their interim report. They're going to have a fuller report for the next assembly, and we'll see whether or not that actually happens either. We believe it will. It's very likely it'll be virtual, but they're hopeful to have a fuller report next year, and there'll probably be some study materials related to that as well. So I'm grateful that you guys have joined me for these last couple of sessions. Tonight, there's some difficult material again, and next week the same. We will spend a little more time on the church next week. This will be a little bit of a different one, just related to some parts of the report. And just a reminder, we're not experts. Obviously, we're just trying our best to figure out this stuff for ourselves and have an honest and safe space to have some conversation. We're recording this for all to see on Zoom, but hopefully people will forgive us if we get things wrong, or we have a few terms out of place, or we don't say the exact right thing. We're just trying to be faithful to our calling to follow Jesus, and trying to figure this stuff out and make the world a bit better than the way we found it. So let's start, and let's begin in prayer. Let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you for gathering us in this night from whatever we've been up to. We're celebrating with one of our gathering this evening, and rejoicing for some good news for them. We're thinking about the future, of course, and we're trying to lean into your hope. Be with us as we sit and listen to the stories and the testimony of the men and women who were a part of the National Inquiry on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Be with us in this time as we hold their names up and lift up this space to create some space for a good conversation around these issues. Give us strength and courage for the journey this evening and into the days ahead, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. And so again, we start with the 4 agreements. Just a reminder to stay engaged with this material as best as you can. You will experience discomfort. Allow yourself to experience that discomfort. Always remember to speak your own truth, not try to speak for others, and expect and accept non-closure. This is something that will not be fixed by session 4. So let's just stick with it and see where we get. So tonight we're looking at the 3rd section, and it's called 4 Pathways, Maintaining Violence, and 4 Rights to Disrupt It. And so as this 3rd section of the study articulates, the National Inquiry essentially identifies 4 pathways that maintain this historical and contemporary colonial violence. And it's advocating, obviously, and we heard last week as well, that we need to counter this kind of stuff that's going on, these pathways, in order to decolonize. That's a part of what we're called to do. And so here's the 4 pathways. The first one is historical, multi-generational, and intergenerational trauma, social and economic marginalization, maintaining the status quo and the lack of institutional will, and finally, ignoring the agency and expertise of Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ peoples. And so it names these 4 as the 4 pathways that continue to maintain this violence. But it's also advocating for 4 rights that can be a way of disrupting these 4 pathways. And essentially these 4 kinds of rights are the right to culture, the right to health, the right to security, and the right to justice. So in order to understand some of the ways in which these pathways play out in the lives of Indigenous women and girls and LGBTQ persons, and conversely, how supporting the four rights named would disrupt that violence and move Canada toward decolonizing, we're going to look at this time at a testimony of a woman named Sija, and listen to her testimony as a way of getting into this material. So one of the women whose testimony weaves throughout the chapter in the final report on the right to security is a witness named Sija. And the report explains this. It says, like many of the witnesses, Sija experienced repeated acts of physical, sexual, and psychological violence throughout her entire life. From witnessing her father stab her mother when she was very young, to witnessing her mother being physically beaten and abused by men as a young girl, to repeated sexual and physical abuse and neglect in various foster homes, to the sexual assault and physical violence she experienced as a teenager and adult. Violence permeates Sija's life story, and her relationships reflect a truth that is unfortunately not uncommon. When she was offering her testimony to the National Inquiry, she said, "I feel like my spirit knows violence." She's summarizing what many Indigenous women and girls and LGBTQ people experience as the almost constant presence of violence that contributes to an overall absence of basic human security. And the final report details the trauma that Sija suffered from devastating experiences that were an intentional part of the process of colonization. But it also highlighted ways in which that trauma has been passed from one generation to another through intergenerational or multi-generational trauma. Families like Sija, who were disrupted and broken by the removal, oh, sorry, figure this little sound out. There we go. There we go, that's better. Sorry. We'll see if that stops that little hissing thing. So anyways, families like Sija's who were disrupted and broken by the removal of children to residential schools through the 60s Scoop or through child welfare agencies are often unable to form family bonds and unable to give children the tools to thrive. And in fact, many of the witnesses drew parallels between the ongoing child apprehension into foster care and residential schools. Specifically, it highlighted the ongoing effects of intergenerational trauma. And so to have a bit of a better understanding of what intergenerational trauma is, we might consider this very significant quote. From our families of origin, we learn foundational life skills and ways of coping, inherit genes and knowledge, and much more. And in this way, we figuratively stand on their shoulders as we keep building upwards. But what happens when the shoulders of one generation have been damaged by devastating experiences? How much does this damage matter to the success of future generations? That's the question that the study sort of asks us. And as we reflect on this, we think about the ways in which there's this sort of cycle that keeps going and keeps happening all the way along. It shows in detail this National Inquiry, the final report. It gives you so much detail about how these devastating experiences will tend to beget more devastating experiences unless there's some form of healing. It's an ongoing and growing cycle. And the final report notes, for example, that the ongoing impacts of residential schools had an impact on the students who were forced to attend them, but then the effects of that trauma, which significantly increased the person's chance of developing severe mental health or medical difficulties, but also the ways in which those challenges that people are having who attended residential schools are then being used as the reason why their own children need to be apprehended by the system. And so rather than working to heal the harm of a residential school survivor, and develop tools for building healthy families, many of the social systems that exist are primed actually to further harm both the survivors and their children by simply taking their children You just imagine that idea that you were a residential school survivor, having been removed from your children, and then because of issues, challenges, difficulties that you're having coping as a parent and a residential school survivor, then the system comes in and says, we need to apprehend your children as well and take them away. The ongoing trauma that occurs there. It disrupts families, it disrupts communities, and it certainly disrupts the access to their culture. And it leaves another generation of children growing up isolated from their families and communities, further enabling cycles of violence and exploitation. So this cycle is active in so many of the stories and lives that the final report examined. And later in the report, we'll learn, for example, that Sija's mother was a residential school survivor. Sija speaks about being a child and seeing her mother drinking, only then to begin talking and crying about her experiences in the residential schools. And Sija identified that she believes that it was the experiences her mother had in the residential schools that left her mother prone to exploitative and violent relationships, which were then the context in which Sija and her sister grew up. And it's in this context of violence that happened to Sija's mother when she was a young child that Sija spoke about the first time she herself internalized the idea that violence was just something that she should expect and accept. And so here's Sija's words. I was playing in the playground and I remember this little boy the same age as me. He wanted me to sit on his lap and go down the slide with him, and I didn't want to. I wanted to go on the slide by myself, and he ended up beating me up. I was in kindergarten, I got this really big black eye. And I remember crying and running home to get my parents, my mom, or somebody to protect me. And all they said was, all the adults around me said that, look how cute, her boyfriend beat her up. And they all laughed and they thought it was funny or cute. Maybe that was the first time I really believed that it was okay for someone to beat me up and hurt me. So today I know that was wrong. I would never have my nieces. I would never do that to my nieces today. If it was instilled in my mind and in my memory, my belief system, that this was okay to be hurt. Another way of not giving me my voice and learning that the people that I think are going to protect me are just not going to do that. So take just a few moments now in the silence and try to imagine something like this happening to you or to someone you love. And then remember in this moment that it did happen to Sija.
Your microphone is still rustily.
Sorry.
I'm supposed to be silent.
So this ongoing cycle. So what Sija describes as instilled in my mind and in my memory, my belief system, is a lesson from intergenerational trauma. And in truth, Sija's life shows the presence of all four of the pathways of harm that the final report describes. Targeting her for physical, sexual, and psychological violence. As the daughter of a residential school survivor, multi-generational and intergenerational trauma shaped her life. We learned from the report that when her mother took Sija and her sister and left the home to escape her violent partner, she and her children were left socially and economically marginalized. And in that marginalized position, more violence entered Sija's life, and she was then sexually abused. And as they grew, Sija's sister was unable to get the help that she needed, and she ended up living on the streets where she was eventually murdered. And through all of this, Sija herself identifies not giving me my voice, not respecting her agency as a significant part of the problem, which she works now to overcome. She notes that she would not treat her nieces in the way that she was treated. She would listen to them. And despite all of these elements, Sija was eventually able to find help and housing and an important part of meeting her right to security. And she's working to break the patterns of intergenerational trauma and colonial violence that harmed her. She now actually has a job as an outreach worker, and she's helping women who are going through what she has gone through. The report also identified at several points that while it's crucial to support Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited LGBTQ people who are the targets of so much violence, that actually Indigenous men and boys have also experienced trauma and violence through colonialism and need support. And this is a truth that we have heard as members of the Justice Ministries reading group as well. And in the words of the report, men and boys are important as well. They need programs and they need support. And so tonight, as we sort of unpack some of this and have a little conversation about a little bit of this, I'd like us just to think about the two questions that they ask, and then I'm going to also share as we conclude tonight, when we get to that part, the confession of the Presbyterian Church in Canada that came from 1994 to then called Aboriginal peoples. We would probably call them Indigenous peoples now. So what do you think of some of this stuff that we've just talked about, or some of the concepts and the pathways and things like this? So the question is, in what ways do you see the 4 pathways to violence in the story that C just shared of her life? So, you know, the study guide already sort of shares a few of those things, but does anyone sort of want to react to some of this, or have a comment or a question or anything you want to share?
I was thinking, is that okay if I go ahead?
Yeah, go for it. Yes, please.
Looking at the last one, ignoring the agency and expertise of Indigenous women, girls, and whatever, and LGBTQ. There's a lot more letters there. I'm just thinking of that little boy on the playground, and she was playing, and he had a very male role there, and such an opportunity to help him understand the agency of others as well as his own agency was missed, in I'm sure many, many more times in her life. So again, it further in that chapter, as you indicated, the idea that male members of society need to be educated as much as women to the agency of each person and their role. And that little boy had taken on the sort of the role of an abuser or a forcer. You know, I'm stronger than you, I can make you do this, right from the very, very young age. So that whole thing of agency, that you have the right to say no and be respected for that, and the right to say how you're feeling, that wasn't there from the very beginning for her.
Yeah, thanks, Rhonda. Absolutely. Yeah.
I would like to just, sorry.
Go ahead, yeah.
I would just like to comment on the health. One of the, what was the second one down?
The right to health,
Right
yes.
to health.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know a bit about that because the Rotary Club has done a big, huge project up in Iqaluit. And when babies are born there, they do not get their hearing tested. So they get quite deaf. And so we did a project that spent not millions, but hundreds of thousands of dollars to bring in to treat the hearing. I forget what they're called. They're hearing things that they have them here in Guelph. Teachers stand at the front with something, and the children wear something, because the problem is the children don't learn English at birth, and they can't hear in school. So yeah, it's been a big job over the years. We won a prize from the Arctic Inspiration. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. We ran 300,000 there, and then we raised thousands and thousands of dollars. But the machines were all donated.
Oh, that's great.
So, but it's been amazing how much it has improved these kids just learning English because they can hear. And hopefully that will help them go on into school. But before they were just quitting.
Right.
They couldn't understand anything.
For sure.
Just another little thing that I remember hearing years ago was that the government gives here in Canada and in our each school gets so much per student.
Hmm.
Students are, and in there they got a lot less per student,
Hmm.
and they should have been getting a lot more.
Right. Yeah.
The way they were treated.
Hmm. Yeah. That comes up in oh, where's I've read it in a couple of different resources and around the school, the investment in a school is based on per capita
Right.
student kind of idea. Yeah. And when there's low numbers, they don't get as much resources. So that becomes a real challenge. And, you'd think there'd be some kind of rebalancing there for sure.
It wasn't only less students; it was less amount per person.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That the value of their students weren't as high as the value of
Right.
other students. Yeah.
And
for
it
sure.
should have been a lot higher.
Definitely. Yeah. Kind of rebalancing.
That comes through the fact that it's not provincially based for Indigenous education. It's all through the Indian Act.
Exactly.
So
Right.
federally based.
Yeah.
And you've pointed out a huge issue of equity.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's colonization. They don't get what we do here in Guelph for every student. The amount of money per student is much more provincially than it is federally.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's ridiculous.
It's terrible.
Yeah. Kate wanted to get in.
Violence side of things. So the story that you told where the child like went to school and was beaten up, and then what's interesting is she comes home and she tells her family or the people that were there, oh, this happened. And a lot of us would probably think in our minds, okay, like we're going to respond with, oh my goodness, that's not good, we got to do something about it. And their response was almost like a normalizing of violence or a normalizing of violence. So they likely experienced something similar in whatever, whether it be in a childhood experience or in their lives. So to them, violence is just part of living. Like, whereas for people who haven't experienced that or haven't lived that life, you would be surprised or shocked by it. But the response of the people that she told was like, oh, that just happened, and and it means that he probably likes you. So that's a very formative, I guess, formative for a young person to hear that. If you were to say that to your own child, oh, he just likes you, and not really react to it, that's pretty telling as to how you're going to perceive violence going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That being said, Kate, we see that all the time too. The whole, she's flirting with him. She's got her, her little boyfriend when we're like infants and stuff. And we're seeing that all of the time, that normalizing of that. In that case, it's a gender roles, obviously, right? Well, she's a girl, so she must like boys. So we're even looking into that complication of it. If you take somebody who is coming from that violent background, now you're looking at somebody that's in the LGBTQ plus community, and now, yeah, that's just compounding exactly what you said there, Kate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, definitely those gender roles or kind of stereotypes around how people are treating each other don't help. And as you rightly point out, the whole piece with we're making assumptions around what spirit or what they are wanting, even at a very kindergarten age. We're launching into almost like, for lack of a better, or like sexualizing what was going on there, and that's another layer too. So it's quite almost perverse, like I was thinking of. But if their lives have been filled with violence, then it's normal, right?
Even more so that that little boy was violent to that little girl.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that in non-Indigenous cultures as well, that's, you know, the joking, throwing back the jokes of, you know, throwing a frog at the girl because you know, something as simple as that we would have thought was cute. And in literature, children's literature, we're seeing this stuff. And yeah, so that's just that, again, that's just adding that extra complicated issue
it's
on
very
exactly what you're saying.
Definitely.
And I think that's part of what I'm getting from that, is that I don't know if love is the right word, but I love that idea of the intergenerational trauma. Part of my uncomfortability was that I was a child and youth worker for about 8 years. I worked in group homes. My group home that I worked in was predominantly teenage girls. In that group home, I had people from all different ethnicities. We had a few Indigenous girls there, two of whom I still regularly keep in touch with, actually. I really love those two girls. They were two of my favorite girls. But these were two girls that were taken from their mothers. They were sisters, taken from their mothers, and a white couple who were fantastic and amazing. They were both child and youth workers as well, had taken them into their care. As they're growing up, that became more difficult. So they ended up in our care. We ended up with both of these girls. Both of these girls since now you're looking into FASD, right? Fetal alcohol syndrome disorders, very common in the Indigenous community. Again, looking at intergenerational trauma. Both of these two girls now have children, and there's been some interesting things happening with them. One of the girls had twins. One of the twins is with a different family. Now she is taking care of one of the twins. And the other one is in a white family. And it's exactly that. It's that intergenerational. And we see it currently going on with the BLM movement going on in the States, where you know, these folks are being taught from a young age that these things are, this is where your role is in society. You're involved in drugs and gangs. The police are bad, all of these things. And whether some of that is valid or not isn't my point, but it's that intergenerational. We're seeing it in people that are, some of the girls that I dealt with, their moms were literally teaching them that the welfare system was the way to get ahead in your life. Have more children, propagate that, get the welfare, get the baby bonus, don't bother with school. Their mom is teaching this, and their grandmother had taught them that, and their grandmother. And that's white kids, that's Black kids, that's Indigenous kids, and it's that intergenerational thing that's happening. And obviously right now we're talking about the Indigenous side of it, and it's blatantly obvious if we look.
Yeah, for sure, Dallas. That's really, yeah, it's neat how for sure the like intergenerational poverty is one of the things that I've been a part of in groups trying to address or work on. That idea of, you know, if you can break that cycle. Habitat for Humanity, one of their concepts is, you know, the idea that if you can give somebody a home and the ability to have a home, that could actually just transform the future generations. It's not just about putting one, you know, family in a home. It's about how is this going to impact the future generations from having a different opportunity. And it is interesting in the Indigenous community. It often becomes a real challenge for some folks, especially related to the history of what's happened. Often you'll hear the sort of criticism or the pushback of, well, that was a long time ago. Like these current folks were not in a residential school, or were not, you know, oppressed in the way that, you know, others in the past were. But all the research and a lot of the stories that we're hearing of the reality of that for folks is that it does have an impact. I've been interested in trauma work for a long time, and one of the things that they've studied is people who've gone through Auschwitz or things, the Holocaust, how somehow there's a propensity within the future generations, like grandkids. There's a higher level of a propensity of that if that person who's like the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor or a residential school survivor, and just somebody who's never had that kind of trauma in their history, that if they both experience a traumatic incident, this person who's experienced intergenerational trauma has a higher propensity to get PTSD or to be impacted in a way. And we do see all the ways in that. And the conversations that we've been having over this past year about equity kind of issues of if you've been kept down at a certain level for a very, very long time, it's very hard to get to the next level. And certainly for our Indigenous community, the way the Indian Act was created, it was meant to keep Indigenous population down. They can't get a break. And unfortunately the optics often from the rest of our culture often is, they get all these freebies. They have Indian status, so they don't pay taxes, or they get to go to school for free. Wouldn't that be nice? It's like, yeah, but it's still not enough. It's still not appropriate. You look at even, the cost of living in Indigenous communities is crazy. You have to buy for like a carton of milk that we would pay, I don't know, a few bucks for, they might have to pay $20 or something crazy like that, right? It's there's all sorts of systemic things that are just keeping people down, and that's why these rights to culture and health and security and justice are hoping to just sort of disrupt these patterns that are continuing with people in the Indigenous community, especially women and girls and people in the LGBTQ. Any other comments about that? Another thing that I found interesting, I was a part of a presentation a couple times, actually, a privilege to be in the room with a presenter, an Indigenous presenter who was presenting to lots of social service agencies, FNCS, Family and Children Services, and healthcare people and city people and stuff like that. And what she did was she did this thing where we all took on roles. She would say like, okay, so you're going to be the leader in the community. You're going to be the children. You're going to be the men. You're going to be the Indian agent, and sort of went through a whole ritual with everybody. Really, really impactful. I'm not going to be able to do it justice by trying to describe it. And I'll spoiler alert, I'll kind of ruin it for you in a sense. The way she ends it is one of the parts that she ends with is she talks about how it impacts the men. So in the communities, because what starts happening is, your kids are taken away. So the kids all get taken away. And if you want to do certain jobs, well, then you have to leave the reserve. You're no longer an Indian anymore. You get married to somebody, you're out, all this kind of disruption. And one of the things she talks about is the impact on the men. And she asks these, it's basically all white guys, and says, how would this make you feel? Like, having witnessed everything that's gone on in your community, and you're the men of the community, you're the ones that are supposed to be warriors, you're the protectors, you're the ones that are supposed to be strong. How do you feel? And then, sort of popcorn in the room is things like, well, I feel like useless. I feel inadequate. I can't do anything to change what's going on here. I feel powerless. And then she flips that and starts talking about how, and then we look at Indigenous young men and how they are perceived by many people in the community and in the culture. And it's like, well, why wouldn't you? Like, they've not been able to participate. They've not been able to have power. They've not been able to protect their families or do anything. And so that's where it becomes that challenge of those communities, no jobs, no opportunities. It becomes very dangerous for them. And then unfortunately, that might lead to drinking, that might lead to mental health concerns, that might lead to more violence in those communities. You know, because as that little boy did, and as the family reacted, it's like, oh yeah, he must be her boyfriend because he hit her. And that's what we're used to, that kind of thing. Yeah, powerful stuff to be thinking about, and trying to think about the ways in which you disrupt it. How do you change these kind of things? Yeah. Other comments or thoughts on any of this?
It's Anne again.
Hi, Anne.
I was just going to say, when I told you about the story about winning that prize, Paul and I went to Ottawa to be part of the group receiving that prize, and 4, I think they were all women, came down from Iqaluit to be there also, and we had lunch together, and I was sitting beside an Indigenous person who actually was the principal of the school there. And she said to me, among many other things, "Thank you for caring." And that really struck me.
Yeah.
Because I think so many people have the wrong idea that all Indigenous people are drunkards.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of those basic human things, right? Everybody has a desire to be seen, like to know that you matter. Those are like very basics. And we talked, I think we talked maybe in the first session, sort of like this stigma, this labeling, this dehumanizing kind of attitude that we sometimes have. And I'm sure I've spoken about my own experience in Northern Ontario, where we would go every summer, and these very nice people who Kate met one time, you know, they had lived up there forever, and the expression up north is you get bushed. You've been in the bush so long, you get bushed. And you know, very insular kind of lives, but their perspective on the Indigenous people was extremely negative and racist, very racist. You know, I can remember as a child all the sort of names that they would be called, and but in that same way of, you know, dehumanizing the Indigenous people who lived in that community, and no desire to sort of ask the bigger question. You know, why, if that's the case, like if you're running into so many, it's that whole, you know, there's babies floating in the water. Someone, you know, a baby's floating in the water. Someone rushes out into the river, saves the baby, yay. But now another baby's in the river, so they go and they save a baby, and yay. But it just keeps happening. No one ever goes to find out where the river starts. Why do babies keep falling in the river? What's going on up there? You know, like what's going on further up the chain? You know, the idea of why wouldn't a community start asking those kind of bigger questions, not just dismissing people as they're lazy, useless, drunks, all this kind of stuff. And hopefully that's maybe where we're at this point as a society. Maybe we are starting to ask the bigger questions of, you know, whether it's related to poverty, racism, all those sort of big questions. You know, how do you change this stuff? Are we just going to accept this is just the way it is? Or can we actually start thinking about the systemic things we might need to shift or change in order to make things better for everyone? That equity sort of question. Thoughts on any of that?
John?
Yes, no.
Do they have their own school up there, or are their education integrated with the white school, if I may use that word?
So from my understanding, I think there are some schools in some reserves up to a certain age, like there's some kind of education or schooling available up to a certain age, as far as I remember. And the reason why they have to get transferred to mostly Thunder Bay, if you're in just from a Northern Ontario perspective, the reason you have to get transferred is to go to high school. So as I understand it, there are some kind of public school system within the reserve communities, but then once you hit a certain age, you then have to go to high school. And unfortunately, the only high school you can go to is the high schools in Thunder Bay. And so kids get sent there, which if you ever read Seven Fallen Feathers, that's one of the stories there where, you know, these kids go missing or turn up dead, and they're all high school students, and you know, the answer from the police service at the time and the answer from the community was, oh, well, you know, these young kids, they get drunk and they don't know how to swim, and, you know, they're just silly. And they fall off the bridge or they fell in the river or something, you know. But then the bigger questions the book asks is, well, what if it's bigger than that? What if there's something more going on there?
So they go to school and they're taught in school, and they must maybe have some sort of an ethical education, and then they go home to the same historical generational behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And they often go home to crowded homes because housing is terrible.
Yeah.
And there's no clean water either. And by the way, those schools are often subpar because you can't get a building that's safe, and also staff that comes and stays, because qualified people to come and teach and stay is really hard.
Yeah. I've heard people over the years. I feel like this, for St. Andrews folks, this is bringing up somebody from a while back, but I think the Pauleyes' daughter-in-law, I think, went up to Northwest Territories or somewhere like that to do some teaching, and she only stayed, I think, a week or something. The housing she was promised was not. She didn't feel safe. There was a lot of. She wasn't treated very well from her experience and stuff like that. But again, if you understand the sort of community and what's going on in those communities, you can sort of get a sense of, well, you can understand why some of these communities are very traumatized and challenged and difficult. But yeah, it's hard to get teachers to stay. The resources aren't very well looked after. Yeah, it's pretty sketchy.
Care workers and doctors that often go into rural and remote and communities in the north, in particular Indigenous communities, if they're not prepared or don't have that experience, it can be quite challenging and overwhelming. And so they, like, a lot of people stick with it, but I think there's a lot of people that find it too much if they're not adequately prepared and have the mentorship to be able to go and do that work. So
I
there's
find
a lack of continuity there too. Sorry.
No, absolutely. To echo that statement, I find a lot of with me being in some of my background has been with St. John Ambulance. So I have a lot of friends that are paramedics, nurses, things like that. Oftentimes there is an encouragement for folks from down south here to go up to the northern communities. There's a monetary encouragement. You go up there and it's often just for short periods of time or contracts. And it's a way to make enough money to pay off school. And meanwhile, I'm getting that 2 or 3 years of experience so that I can apply down in Guelph and get on with the Guelph paramedic service or something like that, or nursing. The same kind of idea. And you're sitting there, you're paying a white person, for lack of a better term, you're paying an educated white person to come up for a few years to do this stuff. Well, why can't we have people from our community come down and get educated and come up? But then it goes back to that comment that I made earlier on. You're getting people from that community that get educated. They go back and they do the same thing that we're doing. I don't want to stay in this, this horrible hole of a place, this third world country, for lack of a better term. I don't want to stay here either. So I'm going to go back down south and I'm going to get a job somewhere else, because now they're going to hire me because I'm Aboriginal. So I have status and I'm going to get hired before somebody else. And I've got the same education as someone. So then it gets into that. So we're getting that brain drain of folks that are competent and trained back down here anyways. So perpetuating that cycle.
It speaks to like Rhonda's point and like that continuity of like building relationships. And when you have people coming up into it's, I think it's not only northern or not only Indigenous, but a lot of northern communities, like professionals that are going in for short term and not staying. And that like it's getting a little better in terms of like there's medical schools and like the universities up there are training people from those communities to work in those communities, but it's still very challenging to maintain the workforce needed and be trauma informed enough to be able to handle it. Because yeah, it takes an experienced person too, like a lot of newer people, as you say, like they're going up to work short term to earn a lot of money in a short period of time, and that could be kind of like that can be tough as a young person, right? Or as any person. I guess.
And the more mature people that are going up there, are they going to take their families with them and put them in an education system and in a housing system that is subpar? So it's a bit of a vicious cycle until the right to health and the right to security provide decent housing and decent water and decent health care, and add to that decent education. It's a big hill to climb, and it seems every government that gets elected says they're going to, you know, at least solve the water problem, but it doesn't happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Anne again. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Anne. You go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say we have very close friends whose daughter and her husband and their kids went up to Calais, and it was. And I think he was doing something with the deadline. But anyway, they went when they were fairly young. They were just in school, and they just came out last year. And the oldest is a boy, and he's in grade 11. He wanted to go back. He enjoyed the life there more than in Guelph. So maybe that's a more, I was gonna say modern town, or I don't know. But I know they just like the whole setup there, the schools, and they don't feel that they got any less education there than now. So
That's good to hear.
that's the other side of it.
Yeah, that's good to hear. That's a community that's maybe doing better than the one that we hear about more. That's good to hear.
Yeah, and I do think they get more money, but it's so expensive to come home for a week or something from there. It's very expensive to fly.
Yeah, I think if you work in the northern communities, well, certainly in the Northwest Territories and maybe in Nunavut as well, you get the supplement that the government provides, but still cost of living up there is
Which
pretty
is
significant.
terrible.
Yeah.
They're allowed to bring a lot of stuff back. So when they do come down, they really load up.
Well, that's good. Kate, you wanted to get in again?
Oh, I was just going to say on the issue with respect to drinking water, I mean, the most basic of human rights, and I think it was mentioned, somebody made the comment around the living conditions. It is like they're refugees in their own country. But there is a podcast called Canada Land, and if anybody listens to podcasts, I don't know if you do, but I believe Canada Land really does a deep dive on that issue with respect to water and how like problematic it is, obviously, and just it's just insane how the system works and prevents this most basic human right from being provided to these communities. It's absolutely ridiculous. I don't know why we can't fix that at the very least.
Absolutely right. I think we all, it is a human right. I mean, and the fact that the UN actually declared it, an outrage against the Canadian government, and said, this is not appropriate. Something's got to be done about it. But yet it's still not fixed. And
I thought there were incentives. There were incentives for physicians, for nurses to go up there and do some work. But I hear what you were saying. The living condition is not appealing, so they don't stay that long. You would think that the government will notice that and do something about it. Here we are trying to help other third world country, etc. And as is said, it's right here at the doorstep, and we're not doing our best to fix it.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to what Kate was saying earlier about, and a couple of people have said it, you know, being trauma informed and also being prepared for what you might face. I think maybe why we do get sort of a collision of impacts that people have when they go to these communities is they make an assumption that I'm in Canada, so it's probably okay. I'm assuming that when someone goes to, I don't know, South Sudan or somewhere, you know, in Southeast Asia that's got hardly, it doesn't have access to drinking water and has wells that people have to go miles. I assume that when people go to those places, they're like, oh, well, you got to be prepared. And just so you know, you're going to be living in this kind of structure, and don't think that there's going to be a lot of amenities. And I think that is the impact when people go to some of these northern communities. They're like, oh my goodness. And I would also wonder, related to the system, and I think, Nolly, you were touching on a little bit, when you go there, we often have our own lens of how you're supposed to, you know, treat one another, how you're supposed to live and how you're supposed to act and behave. And I'm not condoning what goes on in some of these communities, the violence and things like that, but there's this sense of maybe the knee-jerk reaction is, well, we have to bring in family and children services, we have to intervene, we have to take these kids away, we have to do all these kinds of things. And I think what I'm reading and hearing a lot more is, you know, what they need is support to have the community, their own community, come around these situations that are occurring, to find ways of bringing healing, but also find ways of bringing reconciliation, ways of disrupting the violence and some of the things that are happening. Removing their children is not, well, we need to keep kids safe. Removing their children is maybe not the best first step. You know, is there a relative within the community or somebody within the community who the child could go with before we take them out of the community completely, send them into the foster system? Because again, we talked about the stat, I think last week, over 50% of the kids in the foster care system are Indigenous. They're from Indigenous families and they're being raised in a foster system. There's something not quite right about that. And that's what people within the Indigenous community, I think, are advocating for. There should be a way where we can take care of our own kids and support our own families, and help each other to work through some of this stuff with adequate supports come around them. That'd be the hope.
John, and now I'm being argumentative on purpose here.
Go for it.
What do you need to be a supportive home for a child? You need income. You need a house. You need running water. You need this. You need this. Access to healthcare. Access to this. They don't have that up there. So your auntie or your grandmother doesn't have that access. So that doesn't allow the system that we have in. There is reasons why these things are in place, obviously, right? Mm-hmm. I don't want any child to be in a place that doesn't have access to that. Mm-hmm. And you see where my logic is also twisting that into the fact that, well, I don't want any child to be, well, why am I letting these children be in this place in the first place? Well, we need to do something to help these children, but we need to help their parents, and mm-hmm. right, round and round. So yeah.
I mean, it's the idea of if people, well, to use a recent example, and I don't, you know, I'll say I don't know everything and I haven't read all the reports, but when the military went in and supported long-term care facilities during the pandemic over the last few months, and then they wrote that report, you would hope that then the government is going to take that report seriously and address those situations. But the challenge around that is there going to be an investment? Is there going to be financial commitment? What does that mean? It would be the same kind of thing I would believe in the Indigenous communities. If you go into a community and say, you cannot create adequate safety, this isn't an appropriate place for a child to live or grow up. Okay, well, what does the neighbor's house look like? Maybe the same. And the one over there, same. Auntie's house, same. Well, then someone should be coming along and saying, well, then we got to address housing in this community. And that would take a significant investment in those communities. The curious thing in many of their reserves is the government is responsible for housing. They are responsible to house and create housing for those communities. Now, then you get the critique of, well, they just don't know how to take care of the housing. Well, part of it, I believe, from what I've heard, is there isn't a lot of training in those communities for how to deal with stuff. So if the toilet doesn't work anymore, no one might know how to fix it. And the government doesn't send people in to fix it. Or if they do, there's a lot of delays. There's probably tons of paperwork and challenges to make it happen.
Or they don't teach somebody there how to fix it.
Right.
Or they do and they don't want to stay.
Right.
Maybe the person there do not want to know how to fix it. You know, they're so used to being given everything. Why bother? But on the other hand, you know, as parents, you have children growing up in a community. If you want the best if they know enough to want the best for their children, and it's not offered here, and the government cannot come and help us with it here. I mean, Canada is a big country. Why not move to where the facilities are? Why? I know that they like to hunt and fish and do all those things, but in order to promote growth, you've got to move out of that situation. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't remain in that situation. I would leave and go and find health and find good living, and maybe still be on welfare, but try to improve myself. But I don't think they know how to do that.
Mm.
Well, a lot of the stuff we talk about is how we perceive how one should live. And of course, those things make complete sense to us, but the experience or the Indigenous experience would be very distrustful of government, right? So potentially what we perceive as, well, you're just not listening or you're just not doing what we're telling you, might be based on their generational experience with respect to how they've been treated by the government. And early on in the conversation, and some of the stuff you were saying, John, related, like, reminds me of like how little Indigenous people have been valued as a people. So they really have lived and grown up in a world where they are told, and all of the messages are, and all of the legislation and systemic things in society are such that you're really not valued as a people. And so imagine internalizing that as a human being on an individual level and saying, you know, like, I'm kind of useless. I'm just a useless Indian. I'm not, you know, what's my purpose? Like, you know, that a lot of that can affect people's ability to be productive in society, right? So I think there's layers here that we're not even able to perceive because we haven't lived it. And it you know, we can't make those statements on behalf of them, on behalf of the people, because we haven't lived it in the same way. So I mean, I just think it's just we don't know how to think in the way that they have experienced and bringing forward their experience to how we perceive things. Because the other thing I'll add around the children side of things is, honestly, I think a child would rather be in a substandard living situation with a family member than away from their family. Like, I think if you were to ask any, I don't know, again, I could be generalizing my own bias here, but you generally, kids want to stay with their family, right? With their parents or their aunts and uncles or grandmothers and things.
The tricky part with that, though, comes, Kate, that and again, looking at my experience with some of my kids, and looking at their file folders of what they've been through in their lives, because of that trauma that they've had, they're going to stay with that family member that's hurting them. That it's classic battered wife syndrome, for lack of a better term. I know that we've fixed that term, and I don't know what the new one was. At the time it was that. So that's where that complication was. I love what you're saying. Staying with a family, I would much rather have somebody with, but staying with that family that might hurt them. But again, echoing you, my interpretation of the family hurting somebody may be different than what your interpretation is, and who's right. Unfortunately, right now, the government, the Child and Family Services is right. Are they though?
Yeah, and I agree. Like, obviously, you know, there are, again, like, it's so hard to know, like, or put ourselves in that situation if we haven't lived it. And yes, in some instances it does, like, they do need to be separated from their family, but it just, it's part of the issue, I guess. So it speaks to what we keep struggling with. I think what we're really struggling with, and what is really so hard about all of this, is it's a systemic thing, it's cyclical. And how do you break that? Like, you know, sometimes I'll say to John, like, they gotta fix that Indian Act to start. But I don't know, that's my white person issue or my white person perception. What do Indigenous people want, right? And how can we, like, do those things that, like, are, you know, beyond the land recognitions? What do we need to do as a people to ensure that our people in our country have good living conditions as a basic human right? And then, you know, what systemically, what legislatively, and what culturally, and what societally do we need to say, or need to do and say and act and bring forward? If we don't start valuing Indigenous people, I mean, that's even, I think, just part of the issue, is we don't value them as people, or we haven't. I think we're starting to, hopefully. And I think, you know, if we were to ask the average bear on the street, they'd probably say, yeah, no, like, they're good people, or they'll have something to say. But we have to start valuing them. And the missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls, there are so many examples how they're funded in education. All of the examples we've talked about and talking about just demonstrate how little these people are valued. And at the end of the day, they're human beings. Anyways, that's my little soapbox.
I would like to say that why should we think they should come down here? We've helped ruin them. And that's where they want to live, is up there. They don't want to live down here with us. If they, you know, I think a lot of them, that's their life. That's why they don't want to live. And how did their water become a problem? How did that happen? They didn't make it happen. Seeing that with their water being contaminated. You know, I just think that over the years we've treated them so terribly. We've taken their land away from them. And no, I just think that I have a friend that's also said that too. That, oh, they just moved down here and solve all the problems. Well, no. You know, none of us would want to be told we should go somewhere else. Anyway, not to know.
Yeah, those are really good points, and thanks for that perspective, folks. It's yeah, those are, I can't say it any better than that. Let's let me go ahead. Yeah, absolutely.
Just that, like, I think the Native or Indigenous population in Toronto is equal to what is found in Northern Canada. That as many people live off reservation, and the Indigenous people live off reservation as live in reservations. Mm-hmm. Yet in Toronto, I don't have the data with me, but they still have the issue of poverty. Mm-hmm. And difficulty getting good housing, and you know, many issues are still there because of the intergenerational issues.
Yep. Yeah.
So, it's not just in Native reservations that these issues are still a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. You know, the challenges around the homeless population in Toronto, a very large percentage are Indigenous. You know, skewed based on the numbers of people. Like if there was, you know, 10 Indigenous people, like in Toronto, there's too many that are homeless versus the other populations that are there. Sex workers, same kind of thing. The addiction challenges, all those kinds of things. And I think ultimately, you know, as Kate has said, It relates to just not treating, it relates to the stigma, the labeling, and all those kinds of things. You know, you leave the northern community, you come to Toronto, or you come to a place to be, you're disconnecting yourself from your community, from everything you know, from your way of life. Now, lots of people do that, you know, immigrants do that, you know, varieties of peoples do that. But yeah, it's a big challenge to overcome. And certainly if you're connected to this Indian Act and Indian status and all those kind of things, it makes it even more complex along the way. Let me wrap us up tonight. And I wanted to expose you to, or at least give you a sense of, what the Presbyterian Church in Canada did. This is in preparation for next week, because we're going to talk about the church a little more next week. So in 1994, so think of that, 1994, Presbyterian Church in Canada did adopt a confession. So confessing, you know, like apologizing, as it were, confessing, recognizing the church's role in operating residential schools and the harms those schools cause to Indigenous children and their families and communities. And so I'm just going to walk you through what it actually says as a way of closing tonight, so that you can hear these words from the Presbyterian Church in Canada way back in 1994. And they used the term Aboriginal peoples. At that time in 1994, Aboriginal peoples was the appropriate way of speaking of what we now call Indigenous persons. So the Holy Spirit, speaking in and through Scripture, calls the Presbyterian Church in Canada to confession. This confession is our response to the Word of God. We understand our mission and ministry in new ways, in part because of the testimony of Indigenous peoples. Number one, we, the 120th General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, seeking the guidance of the Spirit of God and aware of our own sin and shortcomings, are called to speak to the church we love. We do this out of understandings of our past, not out of any sense of being superior to those who have gone before us, nor out of any sense that we would have done things differently in the same context. It is with humility and in great sorrow that we come before our God and our Aboriginal brothers and sisters with our confession. We acknowledge that the stated policy of the Government of Canada was to assimilate Aboriginal peoples to the dominant culture, and that the Presbyterian Church in Canada cooperated in this policy. We acknowledge that the roots of the harm we have done are found in the attitudes and values of Western European colonialism, and the assumption that what was not yet molded in our image was to be discovered and exploited. As part of that policy, we, with other churches, encourage the government to ban some important spiritual practices through which Aboriginal peoples experience the presence of the Creator God. For the church's complicity in this policy, we ask for forgiveness. We recognize that there were many members of the Presbyterian Church in Canada who, in good faith, gave unstingingly of themselves in love and compassion for their Aboriginal brothers and sisters. We acknowledge their devotion and commend them for their work. We recognize that there were some who, with prophetic insight, were aware of the damage that was being done and protested, but their efforts were thwarted. We acknowledge their insight for the times we did not support them adequately, nor hear their cries for justice. We ask forgiveness. We confess that the Presbyterian Church in Canada presumed to know better than Aboriginal peoples what was needed for life. The church said of our Aboriginal brothers and sisters, if they could be like us, if they could think like us, talk like us, worship like us, sing like us, and work like us, they would know God and therefore would have life abundant. In our cultural arrogance, we have been blind to the ways in which our own understanding of the gospel has been culturally conditioned. And because of our insensitivity to Aboriginal cultures, we have demanded more of the Aboriginal people than the gospel requires, and have thus misrepresented Jesus Christ, who loves all peoples with compassionate, suffering love, that all may come to God through him. For the church's presumption, we ask forgiveness. We confess that with the encouragement and assistance of the Government of Canada, the Presbyterian Church in Canada agreed to take the children of Aboriginal peoples from their homes and place them in residential schools. In these schools, children were deprived of their traditional ways, which were replaced with Euro-Canadian customs that were helpful in the process of assimilation. To carry out this process, the Presbyterian Church in Canada used disciplinary practices which were foreign to Aboriginal peoples and open to exploitation in physical and psychological punishment beyond any Christian maxim of care and discipline. In a setting of obedience and acquiescence, there was opportunity for sexual abuse, and so some were abused. The effect of all this for Aboriginal peoples was the loss of cultural identity and the loss of a secure sense of self. For the Church's insensitivity, we ask forgiveness. We regret that there are those whose lives have been deeply scarred by the effects of the mission and ministry of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. For our Church, we ask forgiveness of God. It is our prayer that God, who is merciful, will guide us in compassionate ways towards helping them to heal. And finally, we ask also for forgiveness from Aboriginal peoples. What we have heard, we acknowledge. It is our hope that those whom we have wronged with a hurt too deep for telling will accept what we have to say. With God's guidance, our Church will seek opportunities to walk with Aboriginal peoples to find healing and wholeness together as God's people.
So are we talking about that next week?
We
Those-
are, yeah.
Those 7 things?
Well, we're going to talk a bit more about how the Church was involved, and we'll touch on that confession again. It'll be mentioned, but I wanted to give you a sense of having been able to see it and sort of process it a bit. And if we want to talk about it, we certainly can next time we gather, for sure.
No,
Sorry.
I was going to say, correct me if I'm wrong here, but did you not, that was 94. The last school in Saskatchewan was closed in 96. So we as a church made an apology before
But not
the
our
last
school.
residential school. Not our school. That's not
Not
my
our
point. Not our school. No, I'm not taking that one.
That's not my school.
Right. But we apologized before they were all even closed. So they were still closed. Yeah, well, I can't believe I'm saying this, but the Presbyterian Church was quite progressive.
Yes, you know, that we did try. We tried to be progressive in our day, and this was delivered to. You know, we made a bit of a show of it. We went to, we met with certain chiefs at the time. We had ceremonies. We did this all over the country, and we tried to do a little something. My tragedy related to all this is that that's basically all we did. And then, I mean, we've done other things. We do have a fund that supports Indigenous ministries. We created an Indigenous ministries animator, we called it, to share more stories. But I would say as a church, I'm not 100% sure, how would you say, that the individual churches really fully got this thing. You know, this was in 94. This was before I became a minister. And I mean, from day one, walking in as a minister in a church anywhere, talking about Indigenous peoples was why would we do that? And yet as a denomination, we were running around the country apologizing to everybody and confessing for what we did. So I'm not sure how deeply ingrained it all was for folks. And so that's what grieves me when it's just a few years ago that we as a church decided to introduce a territorial acknowledgement, because it became trendy in a way. I mean, it was one little step. But man, I mean, that's 20 years later. That's ridiculous. Maybe even 30, right? Yeah. 20. I don't do math well.
Are there
26 years.
Are there Presbyterian churches still functioning in some of these Native communities? Are there churches there that are Presbyterian?
So we do have specific ministries that are Presbyterian, supported by the Presbyterian Church in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
We have a Saskatchewan Saskatchewan Healing Circle, I think it's called. There's an Indigenous minister, Presbyterian minister, Stuart Folster, who supports that community, I think. There's one in Winnipeg. Yeah, if you go on the Presbyterian Church in Canada website, you'll see a number of them. There aren't a ton. We also had a few years back at St. Andrews, Caribou Ministries or Caribou Ministries that's out in BC. A person who was a part of our congregation for a time, his son was a part of that ministry, sort of a house church ministry to Indigenous peoples. So yeah, there's a few ministries that we try to do stuff. You know, again, we're still not there. When I was at General Assembly this past year, like the year before, and when the let me hold on, what are they called, just so I get the right name, when the National Indigenous Ministries Council, so this group of Indigenous peoples, men and women, persons, were standing in front of the entire assembly, so 600 people. And one of the things they said when they were giving their report is, we can't report to the assembly without the permission of like an administrative body of the assembly. Like there's other committees of the church that get to just report directly. They have to report through a larger body. And so one of their points was, we can't even speak without you giving us permission to speak. Like, and we have to go through a hoop before we're allowed to. You know, what's up with that? That's crazy. Whereas other committees of the church, they're able to have direct access to the assembly. This group wasn't. So
Sounds like
yeah, sounds like the government. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, there's been opportunities. We've been trying to see other ways that we can connect and grow those ministries. There's a bit of funding. It's not a lot for projects that are about reconciliation and trying to do stuff in our churches. Yeah.
Interesting.
So, friends, I think we've sat for a while. We've thought for quite deeply, and next week we're going to really get into the church. So that should be fun, I'm sure, and see where that goes.
It's going to be good times.
Indeed, I can only imagine where it's all going to go. Yeah, we'll try and remember. We confessed. We said we did it wrong. But we'll chat about that next week. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate you being with us for this journey, and we'll see you again next Wednesday. Have a good rest of your night. Take care.
John.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys, and thank you.